People who don't knit think that I'm too young to knit or that I must be knitting for my grandchildren. So all my life I've got that. Why are you knitting? That's a waste of time. That's too much trouble. Or they think if I'm not knitting for a grandchild, I must be knitting to save money, which is a crazy stereotype because most of the time I buy expensive yarn and I spend a lot of my time, and what I make is a lot more expensive than buying the thing. It's just way better. So there's stereotypes about what we're making, but also who the people are. That they're all women, that they're mostly old, and that they're unadventurous and not risk-taking. None of those things are true.
Oh, they're ridiculous. I mean, okay, so I'm a grandmother and I'm knitting, but I've been knitting since I was 14. So, there really is, the stereotypes are silly, and they put women down because they make it look like as if, well, you're only good enough for knitting, you're not good enough to be, a real woman or be attractive, so you knit.
I started knitting when I was about 8 years old. You had to knit for one of the tests in brownies, and my mother and grandmothers knew how to knit, and they taught me.
My name is Emily. I'm an Edmontonian, I guess. I've been living here since I was 8 years old, which is about the time that I started to learn how to knit. I learned from my grandmother. I didn't seriously begin to knit until I was about 18 or 19, and I learned or relearned from a friend of mine. Sitting in the passenger seat of her car, she handed me 4 needles, 5 needles, and a ball of sock yarn and said, "You're gonna learn how to make socks."
I'm Lena Breyer. I'm retired software developer. I'm also a fiber artist. I make dolls, and at the moment I'm also doing some knit design work. I learned to knit when I was about 6 or 7. At the time I was in school in the Netherlands, and you learned it in school, and we had to make these little squares for pen wipes because we used fountain pens, and I made this incredible rhomboid with big holes in it, and decided knitting wasn't for me at the time. And then fast forward to where I'm about 14, and there's all sorts of exciting knitwear in fashion that I couldn't afford to buy, and we were near a discount outlet, so I picked up a book and taught myself to knit again, and been knitting ever since.
The act of knitting is a meditative process for me. It's an act of self-care, which is really important. It's time for me, and I really like that about knitting.
I love knitting because I love bright colors mixed together. I like it because I'm good at it. I can do something that not everybody can do. And it's creative, and I can do other things at the same time. When I first came to Edmonton, I wanted to meet people, interesting people who did some of the same things I did. And a friend mentioned that there was a knitting group that met in a pub. I thought, wow, I like beer, I like people, and I like knitting. So it'd be really cool if those things mixed together. So I started coming to pub knitting back when it was across the street at the Elephant and Castle. I met a whole bunch of interesting people. Because of pub knitting, I learned about Ravelry, the online knitting community. Because of pub knitting, I learned about different kinds of yarn that I never used before. I bought yarn from an independent dyer who used to come to pub knitting. I got to be a way better knitter. I got to take a lot more risks because other people at pub knitting showed me what they were doing, and I thought it was cool.
I knit everywhere. I used to bring it to work and knit at lunchtime. I would knit while, big computer batches in the old days would be running. I knit everywhere. My mother called it constructive fidgeting because I could never sit still. Yeah, I started programming back in probably, in 69. I knitted, I cooked, I crocheted, so I was considered okay because I was still very feminine, but I was also a really good programmer, so that was that. But it was sexist industry, that's for sure. You had to really watch what you were wearing. You had to really be a lot more pushy than the guys were. You had to be really more sensitive about your image. Like I said, I also brought my knitting to work.
I work in a male-dominated profession. I'm a mechanical engineer. I used to be an engineering professor, and now I work in the oil and gas industry. Especially when I was younger, in the 70s and 80s, the way that I saw gender roles in those days was that to be accepted in male world, and not just in a male profession, but I played a male-dominated sport. I was a hockey player for 35 years. I felt some pressure that I had to be completely a tomboy, that there was not an awareness of gender fluidity in interests then, or gender presentation. But I found that I loved doing some things with women as a nice change from doing things with men. I was drawn to knitting again as an engineering grad student. I had a Stitch and Bitch group that was all women scientists and engineers and science teachers and math teachers. And we were all people who didn't really have a chance to talk with women in our day-to-day lives. So knitting together was a way to support each other. And that's something that's been one of the themes through my life and through my knitting career, that is just such a contrast with what I do the rest of the time.
Knitting helped. I spent the last 4 years caregiving my mother, who died last spring, and it was the only thing that helped me, through. Just sit there and knit. I knitted endless socks and hats and things, all simple stuff. I made about 3 or 4 of these hats for my youngest daughter out in Halifax. That was during my time when I was caregiving, because you could go around and around, and it was a small project. And then I thought, gee, I'd like to have one of these hats too.
I tend to take on big projects for other people, so I've knit my father, my mother, and my partner's sweaters, which is kind of... Knitting sweaters for me tends to go a lot faster because everybody else in my family is a lot bigger than me. So I was like, why does this take so much wool and why does it take so long? But it's really rewarding to see people that I love wearing something that I put sometimes months into, and that makes me really happy to see that I'm keeping them warm. Knitting has been a great opportunity for me to travel, and it's been one of the guiding things for me when I go to new cities. And this is a perfect example of that. I bought this wool for this hat in Paris, and I found this pom-pom in Brussels. And it's kind of one of those things that's great, because when I wear these things I can say, oh, I bought this wool here, and I got that pom-pom there, and these buttons are from that store. But for me, it's not just about the finished project, it's about the act of knitting. And I think I touched on this earlier about how the act of knitting is a meditative process for me. It's an act of self-care, which is really important. It's time for me, and I really like that about knitting.